What's up everyone, and thank you for stopping by the channel. Today's project is this Poulan Predator chainsaw, and the problem is that after a long storage, the fuel lines need to be replaced. However, after replacing them, it still doesn't want to start. Let's take a good look at it, find out what's wrong with it, and hopefully we can fix it. In this video, we try and repair this chainsaw, however, it may not be the exact repair you need to make to yours. We'll explore other options later in the video. Now it did initially try and start, but that's about it. After that, it simply wouldn't start, so that's how it ended up with us. It even came with a new spark plug in the hope that it would help to get it to start. We'll replace it if we have to. A closer look shows that the primer bulb is also cracked, but in previous videos we've shown that usually isn't the reason why it won't start. A cracked bulb just means you have to pull the rope more times to get it to start. Now, more than likely, the carburetor is the reason why it won't start, but we'll also need to check the fuel lines as well. If they were installed wrong, then it won't start. Now, there is some fuel in the tank, so let's pour it out and look at its condition. We need to check to see if the fuel is stale or if there's some water in it. So it still smells like fuel and the color is excellent. And after letting the fuel settle down a bit, we can also see that there's no water at the bottom of the jar, so the fuel wasn't the reason why this wasn't starting. While the fuel cap is off the tank, we'll check to make sure that the fuel filter is still on the line, which it is. Now, if it was off the line, we would have to definitely inspect the carburetor for a clog. We've gotten so many comments to remove the muffler to check for piston damage, so that's what we're going to do. All we need to do is remove the two bolts on the muffler and remove it from the engine. Now that we can see the piston and the ring, we'll pull on the rope to move the piston up and check for damage. We're looking for damage on the top edge of the piston and on the ring itself. Once the piston makes its way back down, we can see that the piston ring is still shiny and not gouged. Also, the top edge of the piston shows no fresh metal, so there's no damage. This engine is in great condition, so we'll replace the muffler back on it. It's now time to take the top cover off and inspect the fuel lines and eventually the carburetor. Once it's off, we'll need to remove the air filter base so we can get a better view of the fuel lines. There's also a rubbery part on the left side of the carburetor which I want to take off so we can see more of the fuel lines. So the line at the right side is for the fuel filter and it leads under the carb to the left side. This is where the line goes into the fuel tank. On the opposite side of the tank is the fuel return line, and this leads all the way back to the primer bulb by the red recoil assembly on the left side of the engine. The last line goes from the primer bulb to the left side of the carburetor, which is kind of hard to see, but it's near the throttle linkage. We need to take the recoil off so we can get access to the primer bulb and replace it, as the base of the bulb is fastened by two screws. We also need to make sure that the lines are connected correctly as well. So the shorter port on the bulb should go to the left side of the carburetor, which looks to be correct. And the longer port on the bulb should go to the right side of the fuel tank for the return line. So it looks as though the fuel lines were correct, and so that means that the carburetor is our problem. So here's a bag of primer bulbs that was purchased online. Now you can buy them individually, but you get a better deal for buying a multi-pack. Here's a quick tip: when replacing the primer bulb, try replacing the lines one at a time. Try the long port first and then the shorter port next. We won't install the screws just yet until we can confirm that everything is working like it should. It's now time to remove the fuel lines and the throttle linkage from the carburetor so we can remove it from the engine. With the carburetor out of the way, we can get a better look at how the fuel lines are ran. The fuel filter line goes to the right side of the carburetor. The return line at the right side of the fuel tank goes to the primer bulb, and the primer bulb goes to the left side of the carburetor. Now that the carburetor is off the engine, we can remove the top part of the carburetor to see the pumping diaphragm. We can now see the inlet screen, and it's got some dirt covering it, so we'll need to clean it with some carb cleaner. It probably happened when the filter was originally off the fuel line, but it wasn't ran long, so it only got partially clogged. We also need to examine the check valve flaps seen here at 12 o'clock and 5 o'clock to make sure that they are parallel with the rest of the diaphragm, which it is. If it's not, you'll need to buy a rebuild kit. Next, remove the plate covering the metering diaphragm so we can inspect its overall condition. Now, it hasn't hardened over time, but I do see a slight problem. If you turn it sideways, you can see it's slightly crooked and not straight. We don't want to take any chances, so we'll replace it anyway. So here's a pack of diaphragms that I bought online for a few dollars. The only thing I'm looking for is that the stem in the middle is the same as the one I'm replacing. If you're not sure, contact the seller and ask them if it'll work for your application. Now, before we put the carburetor back together, we'll clean out the filter screen and then test it to make sure it's not blocked. To test it, fill the screen with some of the carburetor cleaner and then press the rocker arm assembly on the other side and watch the carburetor cleaner disappear. Now, if it doesn't disappear from the screen, you'll need to remove the screen, soak it, and clean both sides of the screen. Since this one disappeared, we'll put it back together. So now that it's finally back together, let's reinstall the carburetor onto the engine and then test the fuel system before we try starting it. I would suggest connecting the left side fuel line first before stabbing the carburetor on the studs. Before we install the screws for the primer bulb, I want to put some gas into the tank and try priming the fuel system. With the bulb loose, you can see the fuel is actually flowing through the lines like it's supposed to. So when pressing the primer bulb, fuel should flow into the short port on the left side of the primer bulb. Then it will eventually fill up the bulb, and then hopefully it'll go out the long port on the right side, which fortunately for us, it does. That means we can install the filter base, the screws for the primer bulb, and replace the recoil assembly. Another reason why your chainsaw may not be starting is that it's basically worn out. Now, it might start one day, but not another day. Now, to confirm its condition, I would check the compression using a compression tester. I'm not going to replace the top cover just yet in case I need to make some carburetor adjustments. I want you to be able to see exactly what I'm doing. Now, you should never run a chainsaw for long without its top cover as it helps cool the engine. I'm only going to run the engine long enough to make sure that it starts and runs, and I'll adjust the carburetor for cutting wood later on. So it does run on choke, but not off choke. That means that we need to add more fuel at idle. For a better view, I'm going to remove the rubber boot on the left side of the carburetor so you can see both adjustment screws. And if we look at the top cover, we can see the screw closer to the engine, or the one left of screen, is marked L. That's the one we need to adjust for more fuel at low RPM or idle. We'll need to use a special spline tool to help turn the adjustment screw. Now you can buy these on Amazon or eBay for just a few dollars. We'll start by turning the screw a quarter turn counterclockwise and more if we need it. Now it did run just a little bit better, but it didn't stay running. So let's turn the same screw out another quarter turn and see if we can get it to idle. So I ended up turning the L screw out about 3/4 of a turn. However, it's going to need to be cold started again and tuned at least one more time. As the fuel flows through the carburetor, it can basically clean out the carburetor, and the initial adjustment might be just a bit too much. So for right now, we'll replace the air filter and the cover and then cold start it later on. I don't want to adjust the H screw until I try cutting some wood with it. So my question is, after finding out that the fuel was fresh and that the fuel lines were correct, would you still try taking the carburetor apart, or would you just save yourself some time and order a new carburetor? It would have been much easier in comparison to what we just did. I know what I would do, but I'm more curious about your answer. Thank you for watching. I really appreciate your time. Please feel free to ask any questions, and I hope to see you in my next video.